We would welcome a few comments, questions from the audience. Please keep it short so we may be able to answer. And if you are directing your question to somebody specific on the panel, please specify it. Please go ahead.
I'm not sure if this question is perhaps a bit naive, but what would you say if the proposal was made that a potential peace agreement actually incorporates some stipulations on future education on both sides of the conflict? In other words, including the Nakba in the syllabus of Israeli school children, the Holocaust, and differing narratives on all key historical events from both perspectives.
To anyone specific?
To anyone who's actually willing to answer the question.
Professor Al-Hajj, do you want to take this one?
Well, I don't want to hog this. I'm against stipulated history teaching. I think historical inquiry should remain free. The trouble with stipulated history is that you get into national myth-making, into the national myth-making game. I don't think there's a real escape from it. I mean, prescribed textbooks, these are the facts that you must portray, not those facts. This is what happened, not that happened. I think it's dangerous. I think it's too dangerous. I don't want to say any more about that.
Might I ask, though, how you can actually avoid stipulated history? It just depends who creates the bias. The history that I received, for example, is stipulated just by person A as opposed to person B.
I've written about this issue of history, books here in Israel, but I think the same is also in the Palestinian Authority and probably elsewhere. History is always selective. There is the selective tradition in history that you teach whatever you want to teach. You don't teach the whole picture. This is why I think that we can't have the solution through just the formal education. We can have the solution, first of all, through creating a different culture in which you are ready to listen, to understand, and to recognize the narrative of the other people. This is a major issue between the two people, between the Palestinians and Israelis. They have many, many common issues, but our tragedy that we only focus on the differences, only focus on the conflict. But if you look at the two people, at the Palestinians and Israelis, they have tremendous common issues and common future. But as I said in marriage, and I'm sorry to say to the moderator, you know, it's a good example that like in traditional marriage, you have to be convinced that first you have mutual interest, and secondly that you have no better alternative. And you can't live all your life just on the conflict. Look at the Arab countries around. They have taught that, you know, slogans and nationality and all these issues are the central issues, and all of a sudden started the so-called the Arab Spring from one unemployed university graduate in Tunisia who burned himself, and then everything exploded because people don't go to sleep with the flag and wake up with the anthem. They want to live in dignity in their day-to-day life. This is why I think that we have to start from the individual, from the human being, from the basic issues that we share together.
Dr. Joffe?
I started out with giving you a bunch of quotes. I'd like to emphasize one that emerges from this panel from Professor Skidelsky. I think he said the right thing when he said, good history doesn't make peace, but peace makes for good history. And of course, Europe is a very fine example of that phenomenon, but there is a number of intervening variables, what we call it in social science, to make that wondrous event come true. You know, there's no nationalist, I mean, European history is now largely purged of nationalist history, But think of what happened before, and then we had to come between, and then apply it to this area of the world. Two intervening variables after World War II. One, I think, was the total exhaustion of Europe's nations from this long 30 years war with about 70 million dead. And the other thing was a game changer, which was the intrusion of the United States into the system. And by that I mean, suddenly after 500 years of nation state history, there was one power in the system strong enough to secure everybody against each other. It could reassure the Germans against the French against the Germans, the little nations against the big nations. And once the security issue was taken care of, then a lot of other good things could flourish, such as good history. Now, in this area, we have nothing of the kind. There's neither the exhaustion. I think Palestinians and Arabs on one hand, and Israelis on the other, I think we can still kind of try the violent option. We can do it. We can win this one. The Israelis keep winning it, and the Arabs keep telling themselves, eventually we will win it too. So we don't have to change our ways. And there is no, apart from this exhaustion missing, there's of course no third player who could protect each against the other. And so that will preclude the European route. I have one little thing to say to to Majid, who believes that if we only knew each other better, we will get along much better. I can think of many examples where the opposite happens. Once we know each other really well, then we really know why we dislike each other.
Okay, we have a lot of more questions, so let us take 2 or 3 and then try to address them. Yes, gentleman here, and then gentleman here.
Thank you. My name is Uchai Adli. I'm from Israel. This question is for Professor Morris. You were known for many years to be one of the new historians that were criticizing Israel and the Zionist ethos, and it seems that in recent years these have changed. So if we're talking about history, did something change in your views on the history of the creation of Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Morris, hold it for a minute. We'll try and take another question. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. To Professor Majid, and also then I'm interested in Professor Morris's view. You talked very eloquently about the idea of multiculturalism in Israel. But if we accept that the state was established as a Jewish state, with the concept of a law of return, how do you reconcile? Do you accept the fact that the ethos of this country is to be as a Jewish state with all due recognition of minority rights, say to Arabs, Palestinians, any way you want to describe it, or with a thing like a Hatikva, which is the national anthem, or do you say, in fact, that there has to be a national sanction of other symbols, other memorials, etc., and if so, how are they reconciled?
Professor Morris, please.
About the personal question, I can just say briefly, my view is that my historiography and my perception of history hasn't changed at all over the past decades. What has changed is my perception of Palestinian intentions. Up to 2000, or in the years before 2000, during the Oslo process, my sense was that the Palestinians were at last coming around to recognizing and accepting the dictates of history and perhaps agreeing or moving towards agreement on a compromise, a two-state solution for two peoples. And the year 2000, backed by a certain study of the whole conflict as well, persuaded me, and I'm talking about Arafat's no at Camp David and his subsequent no to the Clinton parameters in December 2000. Arafat's no essentially persuaded me that the Palestinians weren't agreeable to a two-state solution. They wanted all of Palestine for themselves, and that is what has changed. It's politics, not my perception of history. I just wanted to say something else about the things said before. I think that historical empathy is essential. That is, mutual historical empathy is essential for movement towards a solution. And Edward Said, incidentally, on the Palestinian side, was one of those who insisted that the Palestinians must understand and study the Holocaust in order to understand their enemy and what motivates him. Unfortunately, and here I'm speaking about the reality as distinct from what Edward Said preached, I don't think the Palestinians, and I don't think the Arab world in general, cares at all or has studied in any way Jewish history, and especially the culmination in some way of the Holocaust. While I think on the Israeli side, I think there has been a measure of historical empathy and recognition of the Palestinians' plight, of what happened in the Nakba, etc., and perhaps my own studies in this field in some way are an example of that. But there is a measure of perception and fellow feeling, understanding the Palestinian side on the Israeli side. I think in Israeli textbooks, school textbooks, certainly before Limor Livnat, there was also an expression of the Palestinian view of things. But I think that, as I say, there's an asymmetry in this historical empathy. It's moving forward on the Israeli side vis-a-vis the Palestinians. On the Arab side, and I'm talking about Palestinians and the Arab and Muslim worlds in general, unfortunately, perhaps the opposite is happening with this new so-called Arab Spring.
Well, first of all, I want to respond to you, because you said that sometimes when you know one another better, then you would hate one another. I'm not searching.
It happens in a lot of marriages.
Yeah, but I'm not. I'm not searching for love or hatred. I'm searching for understanding. And I think that even if you know one another and then you hate one another, as a result of that, knowledge is much better than ignorance. This is a basic issue. And secondly, in terms of my personal experience, I studied Hebrew, as I told you, and then as a sociologist, one of my major issues is the Israeli society. I didn't want to be within an Arab ghetto and writing only on myself. But the more I studied the Jewish population, the more I understood the attitudes of this population, including some attitudes which are perceived by the Arabs as racist. For example, when they speak of me as a demographic danger. It took me a lot of time to understand that it is the result of the very fact that we have a Jewish majority in Israel with a mentality of minority. And they have the fear all the time to become once again a minority. And it's as a result of the Holocaust. It's as a result of the near history. All these issues are so important for me in order to interact with my neighbors and then to reach a common solution. This is a basic issue that I'm talking about. I'm not talking about hatred. I'm not talking about love, because peace shouldn't be based on love or hatred. It should be based on mutual interest. This is the basic issue. Secondly, you asked a very important question regarding how I can reconcile the issue of multiculturalism with the very fact that Israel should be a Jewish state. I have a problem with that. And I just spoke before the session with Ruth Gabizon, who has been doing a lot of writing and, a speech about the issue of democratic and Jewish state. I can see some contradiction between Israel being a Jewish state and democratic state, like it can't be a Muslim state and a democratic state, and can't be a Christian state and a democratic state. But I can understand why many people insist on this issue. This is why, if I want to speak about some sort of multiculturalism, I don't start with the symbols. Once you start with the symbols, you have a problem. And the problem is not only among the Arab population, it's a problem among the Jewish population itself. What do you mean by a Jewish state? At least you have 5 versions among the Jewish population in Israel, the Jewish majority, regarding the contents of a Jewish state. Because it is seen differently by ultra-Orthodox Jews, it's seen differently by the secular Jews, it's seen differently by the Russian immigrants, by different groups in Israel. But I'm afraid that the problem, since there is no common understanding of what does it mean a Jewish state, we reach a situation that we shaped the identity of Israel on what Israel is not on what Israel is. And the common issue that the Jewish majority would agree about is that Israel is not an Arab, it's not a Muslim, it's not a Middle Eastern. So what Israel is? Israel is a state, in my opinion, can be for the Jewish people, because there is a difference between Israel as a state for the Jewish people and a Jewish state. A Jewish state doesn't exist. 30% of the total population of Israel are non-Jews at all. 25% are Arabs, and more than 10% among the Russian immigrants who are Christians or non-Jewish according to the halakha. And more than 40% are non-Zionists. So there is a contradiction between the social structure of Israel and the political culture. This is why, in my opinion, we have to start somewhere. And in terms of peace, yeah, I don't agree that the Palestinians would call it just a Palestinian state for the Palestinians. A state for the Palestinians, yeah, but a Palestinian state means that only a Palestinian come to the state. I don't have any problem with the law, with the Chok HaShvut, because I think that after thousands of years, where the Jewish people have no country of their own, it is their right to have their own country. But we still need the other part. We still need the establishment of a state for the Palestinian people, but both states should be multicultural in the terms that they are the states of all of their citizens, and not only nation states. A nation state means that I'm out.
Okay. Thank you, Professor El-Haj. Dr. Joffe, please.
This is turning into a very Middle Eastern debate here. I'd like to.
It's a European stereotype.
No. Come on. Wait. I would like to bring some analytical clarity into this, but doing so in a perhaps not quite serious manner. If I, as a Jew and Israeli, let's say, I studied the Nakba, it would make me even more afraid of my existence here. Because if that is the narrative, and then we, the Jews, did all this to you, the Palestinians, I have real reason to be afraid. Now, that is the non-serious part. Now the serious part. I think knowing the Nakba or the Holocaust helps us very little in resolving our issues. Knowing that does not take care of, say, who gets Jerusalem. It doesn't take care of the security issues. I mean, Israelis have a good reason to be afraid because they were involved in wars, 5 or 6 or 7 or whatever you want to call. Some of them were aggressive wars, most of them were defensive wars. So understanding each other's traumas might be helpful to us as individuals when we talk to each other about our pain. It doesn't help us deal with the hard case issues of security, and protection and interests in this tiny plot of land that we used to call Palestine and is now called Israel in the West Bank. Let's not overdo this culturalism business when we deal with the very, very hard issues about legitimacy and security, which are very, very hard to resolve. My study of the Holocaust and the Nakba may raise certain sympathies for the other side. It may also raise certain fears, which, as I try to explain, culturalism is not the way to deal with hard, tough issues which have divided these two peoples for the past 100 years.
Thank you, Dr. Joffe. Dr. Pinto, would you like to address this issue? And then we'll take 2 more questions in a minute.
We're really, from a historical perspective, it's all much too early to figure out what will actually happen. Sometimes when I rethink the Oslo years, or even what's going on today in this part of the world, I'm tempted to remember the major legal, constitutional, political debates that took place in the 19th century over Schleswig-Holstein, which was this border region between Denmark and Germany, and people said that there were only 2 experts who knew this, and one of them had died. And so this is one of these issues that no one thinks about Schleswig-Holstein anymore. It was a burning issue back then. So this brings me to another element. We are really right now in the midst of chaos in terms of understanding to what world we're going to go to. And the European question is not an indifferent one in this context, because I don't know which direction Europe will go, but we made much hoopla about the Franco-German reconciliation, and then the German-Polish reconciliation, the German-Czech reconciliation, and people were looking forward to the day when Poland would acknowledge its hegemony over the Ukraine. And what I want to get to right now is that somewhere, if one wants to be a historical pessimist,
Sorry about that.
Okay, if one wants to be a pessimist or a historical realist about post-war Europe, we still don't know where it's going. It can go into some kind of economic wonderful douceur, as you mentioned, getting its act together.
I'm sorry.
Is something important being
Is
said?
there a problem there? Can someone? No, it's fine. Okay, go ahead. I don't know why they.
All right, so,
Sorry.
okay, I'll be 2 seconds. Since we don't know where Europe is going toward, if it will exist even as just beyond a museum or a holiday place, there is a possible
I'm sorry. It's difficult, but we have to ignore it because I understand.
All
it's
right,
nothing
okay, so this is, all right, half a second. We are talking about one thing. Europe today, with all its wonderful beyond peace and so forth, as Joe said, it was perhaps fatigue, but it could also be a slow and inexorable historical irrelevance of sorts. Italy used to be rife with with wars between different Italian city-states. Afterwards, history was no longer there, and therefore peace occurred. Genoa did not make war on Pisa again or Venice. And then it took a while to recreate a blob that became Italy, but Italy, never took on the importance of anything previous. Consequently, we have a problem in terms of evaluating where we stand in historical point. That's all I wanted to say. And with the Middle East, we're really so much in the middle of it that it is virtually impossible to say how it will come out.
Thank you, and I'm sorry for all those interference. As we have 7 more minutes to the end of this session, we will take very quickly the 3 last questions, and we'll use it as concluding remark for the panel. Please. Okay, so I would ask one of the, somebody from the production, if there is any need to finish earlier, please let us know. Otherwise, we'll proceed as planned. Sir, I'm sorry, you go ahead first, the young gentleman, and then the gentleman there at the back, in a minute.
It's working?
Yes, please go ahead, and please be brief so we can answer that.
Stanley Fischer argued recently that his successor has to be an economist who knows the history of the other central banks. Why? Because, argued Stanley Fischer, economic crisis is repeating itself, it's cyclical. Now, is it possible, if Stanley Fischer is right, is it possible that also history is cyclical and repeating itself, and despite of globalization and technology, there is nothing we can do about it?
Thank you. Please go, move the mic over there.
My question is to Professor Al-Haj. What should I say to my son who lives here now, who tells me that his cousin, a doctor who was treating both Arabs and Jews, took his daughter out to coffee the day before she was to be married, and a teenage Palestinian girl came in to the restaurant, blew them up. The mother then celebrated this, wished her other children could do likewise, and the street is named after her. And my son says to me, Dad, you keep talking about peace. He says, how can I put myself into the hands of people who have that kind of an attitude? What do I tell my son?
Thank you. Last question, the young gentleman over there, and we'll conclude with that. I'm sorry.
I was almost afraid that the gentleman in front of me would ask my question, but there's a rise of request of people for social justice. And I wondered what is the effect during history of a monetary system on the ability of people to receive social justice and economic prosperity.
Thank you. As we are running against the clock, I would ask the panel to use this question and interweave into that your concluding remark. 1 minute for each, please. Professor Zagleski, please.
I've always thought that history is actually quite important in economics. You need to know about the history of crises, you need to know about how central banks evolved, and you need to know about other central banks. So I think economics without history is actually a crippled discipline. And therefore, in that sense, I don't think we just have to repeat all our old mistakes. This is where, in this area of science, whereas you're sort of approaching science, you can learn, but then that science has to learn from history too. The second question was, sorry, economic. How can it help? How can it help? Yeah, well, I mean, that's part of history again, and some work better than others. You've got to know something about the conditions for the success and failure of the different monetary systems. I think there are no universal laws. The gold standard worked well in its time. It became unviable, unsustainable. Now we have a non-system. We're in the process of trying to construct a new monetary system, and that's a joint venture of economics and history.
Professor Al-Haj, 1 minute, please.
Well, of course, I can understand what you said. It's part of the conflict, unfortunately. We have had this conflict for the past 100 years, and this conflict has brought a lot of victims. Very, very sad experience of both people, and what I can tell my sons, you can tell your granddaughter that time has come in order to finish this conflict. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Joffe.
I guess peace will be upon us when we have a discussion like this next time, and we will discuss history and not current affairs. Second point, the question about monetary policy does make me believe that we do know something. His history does teach us something.
Continue, please.
I think that's the end of our discussion. Anyway, quickly, one thing that history has taught us: easy money makes for bubbles, and bubbles make for crises. And we are now, again, in a phase of very easy money.
Thank you. Dr. Pinto, would you? Okay, very good. Professor Morris?
I'm
You're okay. So it seems that the burden of history and the past are somewhat weighing too heavy on us, that we get stuck in the present, and we still have to make a huge effort to leap into the future. But we will leave you with the thought that you heard here tonight from the panel. I want to thank every participant here on the panel and the audience for your listening and for your question. Thank you very much.